University. Dignity and Respect at لا sorry Dignity University. فيها Dignity University. أنا ما أقدر.
Hello everyone. Good evening.
مرحبا بكم جميعا.
Depending on where you are in the world. A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the organizers of this event, the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies based here in Doha, and the World Refugee and Migration Council. My name is Sultan Barakat. I'm a professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and an honorary professor at the University of York in the United Kingdom. I'm delighted to moderate today's discussion, in which we shall explore some of the more effective ways of placing refugee return and reintegration at the heart of the international development agenda. The world is currently facing a major displacement crisis, with approximately 80 million people being forcibly uprooted from their homeland, with 45 million of them being displaced within their nation's borders. In 2018, the Arab region alone contributed approximately 40% to the global total of displaced people, with Syria accounting for 13 million, roughly split between refugees and IDPs, followed by Palestine with more than 8 million displaced persons. This time last year, our sister organization, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, led by Dr. Azmi Bishara, held a pioneering conference for Arab academics that brought for the first time academia with professionals to discuss the issue from an Arab perspective. And one of the issues they've highlighted was the importance of ensuring durable solutions to displacement and how critical that is as a strategic challenge facing us all today. It is critical because of the growing political and socioeconomic strain on host states that has been growing over the last few years, which was probably made worse in a number of contexts due to COVID-19 pandemic, as well as due to the recent international pressure on refugees to return home, driven by rising anti-immigrant populism in Europe and elsewhere. Whilst host country integration represents one option for a durable solution, it is refugee return that ultimately offers the most durable of solutions, with a wide range of social and economic benefits to the individuals concerned, the refugees, their communities, as well as their states of origin. Successful return and reintegration requires innovative ways of tackling displacement, not just as a short-term humanitarian issue, but more importantly, as a central piece of reconstruction and development thinking at both the national and regional levels. To help us delve into these issues and offer substantive ideas on how we can best place refugee return and reintegration at the heart of international development, I'm delighted that we have such a distinguished set of speakers with us here today. The plan for today's session is that we kickstart the discussion with a keynote address by His Royal Highness Prince Al-Hassan bin Talal of Jordan, Honorary Chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council. We will then follow with short contributions from Alexandra Belak, the Director of Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, Dr. Abdullah Dadari, United Nations Development Programs Resident Representative in Kabul, and then Ambassador Dr. Ahmed El-Moraikhi, Advisor for the United Nations Secretary General, as well as Mr. Giles Merritt, the founder and Secretary General of Friends of Europe. Following those four interventions, we will then have a chance to receive questions from both the participants and our wider audience. A select number of distinguished academics, practitioners, and policymakers were registered as participants, and they will be able to participate directly in this webinar. So all you need to do, those of you who have that status, all you need to do is to raise your hand, and I shall direct the question to you and turn the audio to you directly. We really want to hear from as many people from amongst our audience, and I know that we've been followed by a few from around the world. And if you happen to be following us through Zoom or Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, please use the question and answer function in those applications, and my colleagues will make sure that I receive your questions and I will address them to the panelists. I know that we have a number of very serious issues to discuss in this hour and a half, and maybe time won't be long enough, but we will try and make sure that our questions and hopefully the responses are as concise as possible throughout this discussion. So to start with, allow me please to introduce His Royal Highness Hassan bin Talal, who is our keynote speaker for today. His Royal Highness is known worldwide for his outstanding contributions to knowledge and wisdom on some of the most difficult issues that have to do with addressing poverty, inequality, and displacement. He wears many hats, including being the president of the Arab Thought Forum and the chairman of the West Asia North Africa Institute. However, today we welcome him in his capacity as the honorary chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council. Your Royal Highness, thank you very much for joining us. It's a great honor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sultan Barakat, and may I thank IHC for what you have contributed by way of hosting this timely meeting. Considering that 85% of the world's refugees are actually hosted in developing countries, and I'm quoting the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, conflicts on the whole are increasingly growing in protractedness. Only 3.9 million refugees were able to return to their homes between 2010 and 2019, compared to roughly 10 million between 2000 and 2010, and 15.3 million in the 1990s. The international expressions of solidarity, whether financial or in terms of resettlement, have grown thin. It is arguably time for humanitarian agencies, development actors, and host states to band together with think tanks, with universities, with civil society, to voice the concerns of not only the state actors of the Global South, but also the swathes of the vulnerable, marginalized, and displaced that call the Global South home. For me, my first world is the third world. As states, we need to be less on the receiving end of politics than on the dispensing end of policies that put the human being first. Of the issues that we have addressed in the call to action issued by the World Refugee and Migration Council, with which some of you may be familiar this year, and before that at the United Nations in January 2019, we call attention to the need for obligations to be shared, including financial contributions and resettlement. However, the pandemic, as the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Gillian Triggs, indicated during her brief to the Executive Committee of the High Commissioner a few weeks ago, profoundly tested the spirit and optimism built upon the Global Compact and Global Forum. UNRWA ran out of funds for the first time in history 2 weeks ago, warning of impending disaster in Gaza and rising insecurity in Lebanon. UNHCR, despite record contributions made at its most recent annual pledging conference in Geneva, and despite its creativity and innovation in introducing zakat to address the question of refugees in certain countries, continues to face a funding shortfall with disproportionate effects on situations in Afghanistan, Burundi, the Central African Republic, the Mediterranean, Iraq, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, and Venezuela. Meanwhile, in North America, a CDC order issued on March the 20th effectively suspended asylum processing for persons traveling from Canada or Mexico, and was indefinitely extended over the objections of the public health authorities. And in Canada, Denmark, and Sweden, policies involving the proactive review of refugees' continued need for protection have been adopted, while Hungary, Poland, and Slovenia have pushed Europe to, in the words of Dawn Schotti, a former director of my old university Center for Refugees at Oxford, says a generalized brutal hostility toward the refugee and asylum seeker is what we are witnessing. And the EU's new pact, migration and asylum, prioritizes border security over access to asylum. It has thus become abundantly clear that the majority of so-called developed countries have now adopted a lockdown, may I say, fortress attitude in terms of refugees and future demographic trends. The problem with encouraging refugee return and reintegration at this juncture with regards to the Syrian conflict is the fact that in the Syrian case, much as in the case of Yemen and Libya, return can only occur when the conditions on the ground are right. Refugee return and reintegration remains an unlikely policy prospect until deep, just, and fair political settlements to these conflicts come into being. And in that context, the European Union was correct in stating, with reference to the Russian-backed conference on refugee return held in Damascus earlier last month, that the priority at present is real action to create conditions for safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return. With only Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Russia, China, and Venezuela attending, the issues were not directly addressed. It is clear that the question of refugee return is tied to and has taken on the same divisions that the question of a political settlement to the conflict has. You might say it is another case of polarity over plurality. Syrian refugees, on the whole, do, however, indicate a strong preference for return, the majority of them citing safety and security risks, limited livelihood opportunities, and lack of shelter and basic services. However, I am thrilled to have a report issued by Stanford University, which has still not been peer group reviewed, which gives us the evidence from Jordan and Lebanon indicating that it is not so much the conditions in host countries that dictate the possibility of return as it is the conditions in countries of origin. Why I'm thrilled? As the authors of the report, Rabab, Masterson, Casales, Hangartner, and Weinstein of the Immigration Policy Lab and at Stanford University suggest, conditions in a refugee's home country are the primary drivers of return intentions. By contrast, the conditions in refugee hosting countries, so-called push factors, play a much smaller role, even in the face of hostility and poor living conditions. Refugees are unlikely to return unless the situation at home improves significantly. Such findings indicate the need to work on parallel tracks in order to place refugee return and reintegration at the heart of international development policy, or dare I say, policy of well-being for mankind, with the centrality of human dignity. From the perspective of the refugees hosting states of the Levant, please remember this word. It's a regional concept steeped in history, the Levant, and their neighbors. The worst alternative to a just and fair post-political settlement is the continued decline in international support to both host and refugee communities, which would mean rising costs, both security and economic, greater vulnerability and marginalization, and as a consequence, rising instability and insecurity.
No.
And so on. If I may continue, on the one side, there is a need in both regional refugee hosting countries and those countries which exhibit drastically lower numbers of refugees and asylum seekers to move away from a status-based approach to the vulnerability-based approach. I'd like to remind you that the Bretton Woods Community for many, many years, and in our case, with reference to Palestinian refugees, would refer to them as political economy, which meant that they were beyond the pale, so to speak, and that development had to be initiated by us in conjunction with the Palestinians directly, which we have been able to do up to a point. But in Jordan, I would like to say, to have ensured that no refugee is excluded from the care provided to COVID patients, despite the Herculean challenge posed by the pandemic to our fragile healthcare system, and in other countries, pushbacks, extraterritorial processing, and so-called safe third country regimes have become the norm. We are not sufficiently developed to digitalize our government, our private sector, and our civil society, and consequently, we learn every day a little more about the term invented in this part of the world by Al-Khawarizm, algorithmic weighting. In the Eurasian and Euro-African geopolitical context, we feel they must be nurtured with active involvement and support of the region's geopolitical players. Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. I remember my friend Raymond Hinnebusch at St. Andrews University arguing that two powers that have the greatest interest in ameliorating the Syrian crisis, Russia and the European Union, enjoy the greatest leverage over the regime and elements of the opposition, respectively. It is not difficult to imagine a scenario where Jordan can contribute to the effort to bridge the expectation gaps between Moscow and Brussels concerning a political settlement that would open the door to some reconstruction funding, which would in turn possibly begin to create the conditions necessary for return. After all, and sadly, regrettably, the impression in many parts of this region is that the United States would rather inflict pain on the Syrian population in the unrealistic hope that this will eventually pressure the regime into talks or generate a revolt against it. Iran has insufficient leverage and resources, and China is insufficiently invested in the conflict. As Hinnebusch argues, the EU has the carrots, the funds, but in making unrealistic demands regarding a political settlement, it may dissipate its potential leverage. Russia needs to accept that enough political reform to co-opt major portions of the opposition is unavoidable and ought to be able to get more leverage via sticks, intimating that its commitment, and I'm quoting Hinnebusch, is neither open-ended nor unlimited and depends on progress on a more inclusive progress. Both the EU and Russia would also have to understand that the alternative to some form of a minimally satisfying and agreed upon political settlement would be worse. A failing state with potentially damaging spillover effects for Europe and its regional allies, and the loss of its significant investment in the stabilization of Syria for Russia. As for the stabilization of the Levant, I have often called for countries that are currently hosting Syrian refugees, and in particular Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and of course Iraq and Egypt, and indeed an agenda, particularly during these coming few months of transformation or evolution, let us hope, in the United States, that we can at least build a vision of stabilizing the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean. Let us hope that the issues, the agendas of the Eastern Mediterranean and of the Levant can coincide on one important element, and that is investment in human capital. The alternatives are unthinkable. Greater reconstruction funds tied with incremental increases in political inclusion and reform. Policies such as transitional justice mechanisms as they pertain to local grievances, forced disappearances, massacres, sieges, must be stopped. Otherwise, the conflict in Syria is likely to take on the protracted nature of another conflict in the region, the Arab-Israeli one. The incoming Biden administration may be constrained by the Caesar Act in its policy towards Syria, which enjoyed rare and wide partisan support in Congress, although funds can be channeled through a coordinating system similar to INSTEX, the instrument in support of trade exchanges, which was designed by the EU to encourage Tehran to remain in the JCPOA by allowing for bilateral trade without relying on direct financial transfers to Iranian entities, sanctioned by the US. There are also various forms of assistance that fall in a gray area between human and reconstruction assistance that can be leveraged, as is currently being done, to re-establish essential services of water in formerly opposition-held areas that the regime has less of an interest in rehabilitating. Talks with the United States on a regional basis may even open the way for additional humanitarian waivers in the event that Zakat funds or an international or universal Zakat foundation is established. I want to thank you for your kind attention, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I have whet your appetite for an interesting discussion. I conclude by saying that a high proportion of displaced suffer from trauma and loss. Women and girls are particularly vulnerable. A mental health working group has been active. One priority is to promote the transition of expertise and know-how in this field from NGOs to Jordanian institutions in the public and private sectors. Worldwide, ladies and gentlemen, 94% of forcibly displaced persons live in cities. Displaced individuals can easily fall off the radar, especially in urban locations. This is why municipalities are part of the process towards sustainable cities. And this is why I would also like to say that I am delighted to have been hosted by Canada as World Conference for Refugees and Migrants, with the Global Affairs Canada focusing on cultural anthropology, as I would describe it, ethnicity and migration, and in particular in terms of the number of feminist initiatives, including Global Affairs Canada's Gender Equality and Humanitarian Action Policy and Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. If we are going to be creative and innovative, let us understand the importance of these initiatives and others to which I can refer later. Thank you again for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Sidi Hassan, for this wonderful introduction. As expected, you've really covered a great deal of ground, all the way from the very local to the very global, in relation to what the issues are and what are the challenges facing refugees, displaced, and their return. I noted many issues which will come back to you maybe later in terms of questions over. But one issue really struck me is the emphasis you placed on the need to protect dignity. And I think that in itself requires a really a lot of discussion and in-depth discussion as to how we can make what has very much become mechanical policy and responses into policies and action that put people's dignity first, in appreciation of them being the core actor for the development and stability in our region and elsewhere. With your permission, I'd like now to move on to our second speaker, Ms. Alexandra Bilak, who is the director of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center based in Geneva. Ms. Bilak joined the IDMC in 2014, first as the head of policy and research, and later as the director in 2016. In 2019, she was appointed as a member of the Expert Advisory Group for the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement. She brings to the IDMC a great deal of practical experience, on the ground experience, And of course, she is very widely published and has been advocating on behalf of internally displaced for a long time. Would like Alexandra now to take the floor and maybe build on what some of what Sidi Hassan addressed, with a specific focus on the issue of internally displaced and how that may differ from refugees. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Sultan, and good afternoon and good evening to all of you ladies and gentlemen. And a big thank you to CHS for organizing this event, which focuses on such an important topic. It's an important topic for several reasons, many of which have been laid out very well just now by His Royal Highness. As you said, the issue of refugee return and reintegration is critical because it touches on the present and future well-being and stability of countries and communities. And it has become, as such, I would say, the test case now for the effectiveness and the success of national and international development policy. I would like to place this issue in a wider context of forced displacement and human mobility, looking beyond the refugee category to what we call the full displacement continuum. Indeed, displacement does not start or end at a border. Looking at global numbers, the majority of the world's forcibly displaced today, be it by conflict, by violence, or by disasters, are displaced inside their countries of origin. At the end of 2019, IDMC estimates that there were 50.8 million IDPs, internally displaced people, which is nearly double the number of global refugees. Of the 45 million IDPs that are displaced by conflict, 34 million live in only 10 countries. These are Syria, Colombia, DRC, Yemen, Afghanistan, Somalia, Nigeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Ethiopia. Now, these countries are also some of the largest refugee-producing countries in the world, which shows that there is a link between internal displacement and cross-border movement. Those IDPs who experience protracted crisis in particular and who don't find protection and assistance at home will, in some cases, cross borders to find that assistance elsewhere. Similarly, refugees who are returning back to their country of origin and finding upon arrival the same conditions of insecurity that forced them to leave in the first place may become internally displaced again. So although return is considered the preferred solution to displacement crises, a return movement in itself, as has already been said, doesn't always constitute an end to displacement. According to the definition of a durable solution contained in the Interagency Standing Committee's framework on durable solutions for IDPs, a durable solution is achieved only when internally displaced persons no longer have any specific assistance or protection needs that are linked to their displacement, and only when they can enjoy their human rights without discrimination on account of their displacement. Now, if we applied this criteria or this definition to returning refugees, many would in fact be considered internally displaced. Over the last 2 years, my team at IDMC has conducted close to 1,500 interviews with IDPs, with refugees, and with returning refugees from Afghanistan, from Colombia, Iraq, Myanmar, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Yemen. And over 3/4 of all the returning refugees who we surveyed, of all the returning refugees who we surveyed, over 3/4 were living outside their area of origin at the time of the research. Most had been unable to complete their return journey, and others had been displaced again after return. Even among those who'd been able to resettle in their area of origin, many were finding it difficult to rebuild their lives and remained in situations of heightened vulnerability. So the challenges met by returning refugees make it impossible to qualify their return as sustainable. They meet several challenges. Some go back to their former homes, as I said, only to be displaced again by conflict or by violence. Others are even unable to return to their areas of origin at all. In South Sudan, for example, we met many returning refugees living in what we call protection of civilian sites because they felt unsafe going back to their areas of origin. Upon return, they're also not often guaranteed an adequate standard of living. 40% who owned property prior to their displacement said that it had since been destroyed, and many others said that their property had been damaged. For those whose homes have been destroyed, damaged, or occupied, opportunities for property restitution or compensation are often limited. This is the case from Iraq to Nigeria, and in some places, like Colombia, those who even seek property restitution are sometimes then targeted by armed groups. His Royal Highness made reference to transitional justice mechanisms, and I think in this particular case, access to damaged property and restitution of assets should be an integral part of transitional justice mechanisms that are sadly often lacking in many of these countries. Access to employment and livelihoods is another hurdle, since their assets are often lost or destroyed following displacement. And actually, we found that over 80% of returning refugees that we surveyed were finding it difficult or even impossible to survive on their current income. There are also all sorts of other obstacles, some of which have been mentioned. Of course, the issue of mental health is a critical one. The trauma, the loss that is suffered by refugees or IDPs is often very underreported and overlooked by many assistance programs, as well as the lack of documentation, the loss of personal documentation, which becomes an obstacle to access other forms of either education or income. Despite these challenges and the inability of many returnees to find durable solutions, very few returning refugees actually end up being counted and included in IDP figures. And likewise, unless they live in IDP settlements, returning refugees are unlikely to receive any form of assistance beyond the basic reintegration package that they're given during their return movement. When it comes to returning IDPs, we see very similar challenges. In Iraq, for example, large-scale closure of IDP camps is pushing IDPs to return, but it's likely that it will take a long time for them to effectively reintegrate in their communities because they're facing a lack of housing upon return, continued insecurity, and of course the remaining presence of mines in many of the return areas. We're concerned, therefore, that the closure of these camps could trigger secondary or tertiary displacements, as we've seen in other contexts. Likewise, in Nigeria right now, the government's call to close IDP camps in Borno State means that the vast majority of former IDPs who are returning to their homes in northeast Nigeria are facing high security risks and are returning to areas which are hard to access for humanitarian agencies who don't have a presence on the ground. There are, however, some positive examples of government responses and inclusion of returnees in longer-term development planning. In Afghanistan's 2013 national IDP policy, for example, the definition of IDPs includes returning refugees and deported migrants who are unable to settle in their places of origin as a result of insecurity. As a result, both IDPs and returning refugees have a right to request and to receive humanitarian assistance. In the same way, Somalia has also developed a national policy on refugee returnees and on IDPs, in which returning refugees who are unable to return to their areas of origin or who experience secondary displacement upon return are categorized as IDPs. However, despite this, and let me end on this note, more needs to be done to ensure that returning refugees are not considered to have achieved a durable solution simply because they've arrived back in their country of origin. Displacement, both internal and cross-border, should be considered as a continuum so that the proposed solutions encompass the issue more holistically and so that return can be incentivized whilst at the same time maintaining social cohesion and contributing to longer-term peace and stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you particularly for emphasizing the difference maybe in policy and responses between internally displaced and refugees, where despite the fact that there majority of the displaced are internally stuck within their own boundaries, there may be less attention given to them, and more so maybe less connection between the political settlement issues that Sidi Hassan spoke about and the longer term reconstruction planning and their return to home. I'll come back to you maybe later with further questions, but I'll leave you with one to think about for now, which we face in Sudan and potentially in some parts of Syria, that within the country, there's been a resettlement of other communities, equally nationals of that same country, taking place of those who've been displaced internally. And because of the length of the conflict, it has complicated the scene. It would be very good maybe when we come back to the discussion, if you can shed some light on what you think would be an appropriate response to this kind of context. Thank you very much. I'll turn now to our next speaker, Dr. Abdallah Al-Dardari. Abdallah Dardari is the UNDP's resident representative in Kabul, Afghanistan. And prior to this, he was working at the World Bank. And before that, and since September 2014, he worked as Deputy Executive Secretary of ESCWA in Beirut. He has served in several positions in the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, first as head of the State Planning Commission, where he worked from 2003 to 2005. It was there that he started authoring Syria's 10th five-year plan, seen very much as the blueprint of reforms in Syria from 2006 to 2011. In 2005, Dardari was appointed as Deputy Prime Minister of Economic Affairs, and he has served as Minister of Planning between 2006 and 2008. So you can see that he brings a great deal of expertise in relation to long-term planning, development and reconstruction, and we're hoping that we're looking forward to him linking that to the issue of refugee return in Afghanistan. The floor is yours, Dr. Dardari.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sultan. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here with you tonight, and with especially with His Royal Highness Sidi Al Hassan with us. And I will definitely refer to the pull and push factors that he presented to us earlier. Afghanistan today has around 3 million refugees still outside the country, mainly in Pakistan and in Iran. Those 3 million refugees, if they return to the country over the next 3 years, and we are just doing some modeling and simulations on that as we speak, they will actually lead to an increase in unemployment by at least 6 percentage points, an increase in poverty rates, and a reduction in GDP, and especially GDP per capita, by 8%. The reason for that is that the labor market in Afghanistan today is what we call a rigid labor market. Unemployment is almost 70% now after the COVID-19 pandemic. So the newcomers, if they start returning, there is no place for them in the labor market, which means they will only push the average wage in the country down, and they will only lead to a decrease in GDP per capita without any tangible increase in GDP in general. Had it been a less rigid labor market, there would have been some space for those refugees to go to productive sectors. And in fact, in a more flexible labor market, they could have they could increase GDP by about 3.4 percentage points, and they would even increase GDP per capita. So what I'm trying to say is that the pull factor in the country is going to be a determining factor, first on how many people return, but then most importantly, what will happen to those people and what will happen to the economy and the host communities receiving them. In other calculations that we have been making, there are different scenarios for social protection schemes for this possible return. A social protection umbrella that can provide cash transfers to 1 million returnees every year for 3 years will cost about 5.5% of Afghanistan's GDP. That's almost $1.1 billion a year. This is exactly third of the 3.3 billion pledged at the Geneva Conference for Afghanistan just a few days ago. Now, if third of the pledges would go to a temporary cash transfer program that would not change the structure of the economy, And it would not lead to a dramatic increase in growth, employment, and inclusion in the Afghanistan economy. It is clear that we will need much more resources in order to absorb, but absorption from a point of view of sustainable economic and inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And we know now that this is the maximum the donors are willing to give to Afghanistan or capable of giving to Afghanistan over the next 4 years, over the possible years of return, and hopefully, inshallah, the possible years of peace, as the peace talks painfully but gradually and slowly moving forward in Doha. So the return is a real possibility, which requires a completely different way of doing business regarding absorption of refugees. Yes, we will still need massive humanitarian aid, but it's very clear from the simple numbers that I gave you that humanitarian aid alone will not be sufficient. In fact, humanitarian aid, even if we spend the $1.1 billion of cash transfers I'm telling you about, levels of unemployment will remain the same. What is required is a changing in the needle from focus on humanitarian aid to Afghanistan to bringing development to center stage. Now, we know that development aid also is capped by these 3.3 billion, because this is the number for both humanitarian and development aid. And we know that 3.3 billion a year will maintain, if not even increase the levels of poverty and unemployment. So what is required is a paradigm shift in the structure of the Afghanistan economy away from rent to a much more productive economy. What is required is a much stronger integration of the Afghanistan economy in regional and global economy. We estimated that the potential for improved relations, trade relations with the region will give Afghanistan 4 percentage points of GDP growth. That is remarkable. So regional integration, changes in the value chains in Afghanistan, focusing on value job creation rather than on rent economy as it has been the case, and also moving from funding to financing. At the moment, Afghanistan has become clear to all of us that even if we could receive the $3.3 billion a year, first, there is an absorption capacity. Secondly, that funding is not sufficient. The country needs at least additional $1 billion of private investments every year to make a dent in the current levels of employment and economic growth. And that in itself is so essential in order to bring in the refugees, to bring them back, and translate them into an economic opportunity for Afghanistan. Refugees in Iran and Pakistan bring higher levels of skills than the population inside the country. They have seen different experiences in job creation and entrepreneurship. If the economic structures move in the direction I've been talking about, in the direction of creating a real pull factor, not just push factor from Iran and Pakistan, but a real pull factor inside Afghanistan, those refugees can become a very powerful force for growth. Our estimate today is that ceteris paribus, with nothing else changing, the return of those refugees in a more flexible labor market would give Afghanistan 3.5 percentage points increase in GDP. That's considerable, but not sufficient. And therefore, ceteris paribus doesn't work anymore. Business as usual doesn't work anymore. And what's called for is this paradigm shift in the structure of the Afghanistan economy. This means that aid should focus on changing that, inducing this paradigm shift. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah. I think this is wonderful summary of what are the challenges that Afghanistan face today, particularly in the light of the talks in Doha. I think development is again at the heart of this political stability, and for them to reach an agreement, it's got to be addressed. I'm just wondering, maybe when we come back to the round of discussion, are you doing anything about understanding the conditions and the skills of the displaced in the place of displacement at the moment? And are there any plans to work with the host country on a transitional phase where programs of collaboration can take place to make sure that we build, as you rightly say, on the economic opportunities that can be created by these people based on the skills they've acquired over more than 20 or 30 years of displacement? But we'll come back to this. And now I'd like to turn to Dr. Ahmed Al-Muraikhi. Ambassador Dr. Ahmed Al-Muraikhi is an advisor to the United Nations Secretary General. Prior to that, he served as the United Nations Secretary General's humanitarian envoy from December 2016 until 2019. He also served as an ambassador to the state of Qatar at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Dr. Al-Muraikhi is a member of the UN SERF Advisory Group and had been elected to be the vice chair of the group back in October 2015. He served as vice president of the Qatar Regulatory Authority for Charitable Activities, and that since 2014, and I think this post continues. At the same time, he is the founding, or was the founding director of the International Development Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he served from 2010 to 2016, and had also served as Director General of the Qatar Development Fund. Dr. Al-Muraikhi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Sultan, and it's an honor to be with His Royal Highness today, and with all what I've heard with the distinguished panelists as well. We are as they said, the number speaks. So I think we have to go to how can we find the best solution for all these crises, especially we now facing the country fatigue. The most of the country, the member state, they said until when we're going to pay and contribute. Their contribution is generous to the UN, but I think we have to think out of the box and find out how can we also face all these kind of crises. Nowadays, I am leading the two initiatives, one with the private sector, and one I'm trying to find the way for the Islamic social finance. The private sector, they play very crucial role. I've been in many of the refugees camps, and I saw how much the impact of the private sector that has been have in the camps and the refugees camps. And as Royal Highness said, the dignity, it is very important. How can we save the refugees' dignity? And I can give you one example with the private sector. When we visit one of the camps, and the MasterCard came and tried to implement the card instead of voucher or the cash in the refugees camp, and it was very successful that we save at least the dignity of the refugees. So this initiative, which it's called a Global Humanitarian Action Executive Alliance, is to bring the private sector with the UN agencies in the executive level. There is a lot of project and a lot of effort from the UN and the private sector, but most of those or these efforts, it is individual, whether with one UN agencies and one private sector. But the Gaia, or Global Humanitarian Action Executive Alliance, try to bring all or most of the private sector and the companies who are working with the UN in one table and try to solve one of the problems that facing the UN agencies, like education, like health. Like now we are in COVID. How can we come together and try to solve this problem in different perspective, in terms of private sector perspectives, because each of the private sector each private sector has their own skills and the know-how to do it on the ground. So when we sit together and try to solve one problem, I think this will be very effective and very crucial. Another initiative which is the Islamic social finance, and His Royal Highness also mentioned about the zakat. I think this is one of the most important issue nowadays. How can we use the zakat fund through the UN? As you know, the money transfer nowadays, it's become very difficult to transfer from country to country. I think if we can find a vehicle and a mechanism through the UN, I think it will be easy to use it for the refugees. I've been in UNRWA camps, and I saw how much they need the cash, and the zakat could solve this kind of a problem. And just a very simple calculation: if we have the zakat from only the Islamic company, it will be around $300 billion. So just imagine, it is according to the study that I've read, it is between 300 billions to 600 billions. For example, if we just take the humanitarian overview, what we need only 35 billions. So I think if we use the Islamic social finance, just the zakat, I think it will fill the gap that we needed to help the people in need. So I think we have to think out of the box. We have to find the means and to bring everyone in board and try to solve all the problem. It is not only the private sector, not only the member state, but also the NGOs, the academia. I think everyone, we should, even the refugees themselves, we should also bring them to us and listen, because we used to act according to the report that we have, but most of the time we not listen to the refugees and the people who are in need, and how can we help them, because just a tiny idea from them might help us to improve our way to serve these people who are in need. So I think we should, we should have the call everyone to come and try to contribute in this matter, to reach up and to just not left anyone behind. So I think if we just try to get the private sector and try to use the know-how of the private sector and try to do it in an innovative way rather than do it as business as usual, I think we will be more effective. And also, if we bring the Islamic social finance and try to get benefit from zakat, from sadaqat, from awqaf, and do it through the UN, it will be also more effective, and I think it will the impact, it will be tremendous. So this initiative, what I'm doing actually, because the initiative is started from the World Humanitarian Summit in in Turkey, but how can we implement it? So we need to have this kind of dialogue between the specialists in Zakat and the UN agencies as well, and try to bring them together and try to understand more about Zakat and how can we implement it through the UN. And in this case, I think we can reach to a limit that we can, fill the gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, and thank you for bringing our attention to the issue of the private sector, which I think maybe in the context of rehabilitation and reconstruction and return has even a greater opportunity to partner with and to work constructively in providing solutions and finance. We'll again come back to this in the general discussion. And now I'd like to move to our last but not least speaker, Mr. Giles Merritt, who has founded Friends of Europe back in 1999 and its policy journal, Europe's World, in 2005. His career as a journalist spanned 15 years, first as a Financial Times foreign correspondent and later as a contributor of op-ed and columns to the International Herald Tribune on European affairs. In 2010, he was named by the Financial Times as one of 30 Eurostars who most influence thinking on Europe's future. His latest book is Slippery Slope, was published in 2016, and in which he addressed the troubles faced by the future of Europe. Giles, we'd very much like to hear from you, and in particular, maybe on the issue of the push factor and Europe's attitude to migrants.
Thank you very much indeed, Sultan. My latest book, in fact, is called People Power, Why We Need More Migrants. And I think it's with that background that perhaps I'd like to advance a few ideas. Let me first say I feel rather humbled to be sharing a platform with so many real experts and all of you who do so much hard work confronting an enormous problem that I think most people around the world are not adequately informed about. What I'd like to suggest is a number of observations plus a recommendation. My first observation, Prince Hassan started saying this, and everybody has since echoed it. We're fighting a losing battle. The problem is getting worse, much faster than it's being fixed. I mean, displacement around the world runs at about 3% of the global population. Very evenly, but the global population is going up like that. So our solutions are being outstripped by the problem. So what to do about this? Well, the first thing that occurs to me is that perhaps we should rethink a lot of 20th century structures. The first one that comes to mind for me is the 70-year-old, next year, Geneva Convention, distinguishing migrants, economic migrants, from political refugees. I'd like to raise the question, is that really helping? It was a Cold War device. It was actually meant to protect people against political trouble, chiefly from the Soviet bloc. So I ask, doesn't it actually make things worse at the moment? Shouldn't we be finding a way around the Geneva Convention? That's one idea. My second thing is about the European Union. The book I've just finished is mainly focused on Europe's lack of policies, its need for more manpower, and its inability to, the EU's inability to get its member states lined up in any useful way. But at the same time, the European Union is a wonderful example of countries working together. So with people like Antonio Vitorino, ex-EU commissioner, now head of the, I can't help wondering, do we do enough about, do we do enough about getting the EU and the UN to work together? Have we rethought that? I need to ask the organizers, am I still visible to everybody? Okay. Next thing, development policy. We tend to think of aid rather than trade, but I really think we need to be rethinking the way that rich countries can do much more for poorer countries from where migration basically comes, either internally or exported. Can we not do much more on the trade front in helping countries? I was looking at the figures. The head of the European Investment Bank reckons that there is a funding gap for things that affect migration or immigration from sub-Saharan Africa of 2.3 trillion. So all the billions we've heard pale into insignificance. That's sub-Saharan Africa. Add in the Arab world, you've got over 3 trillion. Add in the rest of the sources of displacement, Asia, Latin America, and so on. You're looking at $6 trillion of missing money. So what are we going to do about that? Well, I think the first thing is just let's take the COVID crisis as a catalyst for rethinking the way we present the whole problem and enlist much more public interest and support. Because I found when researching my book on migration, it was very hard to get an overall picture. It's a muddle of different statistics, different points of view. So my final suggestion is that the UN and the EU and perhaps America under its new administration put together an info board, something that everybody can click onto and which tells you at a glance a number of things, the current statistics, but arranged in an understandable way. A league table of what different governments are doing and not doing. A league table on the private sector, what the private sector, where is the problem and where is the solution. And finally, a look at the sort of patterns that we're looking at, projections of where things are going to get worse, projections on where we are on refugee and IDP camps, and trends and the movements of people around the world. But something that we have as a common thing, we harness new technology and we have something that people can call up on their laptops at any moment and check and get a picture of how things are going. Because as an observer rather than an actor like the rest of my distinguished colleagues, I know how important it is to be able to get an understanding of this enormously complex picture. Thank you, Sultan.
Thank you very much, Jazz. You put forward some very bold and spot-on recommendations ranging from addressing global governing structures like the Geneva Convention all the way to how Europe should look at opportunity in migration and displacement. But I would like now to, if you allow me to go back to the speakers. We'll start with His Royal Highness to help us make sense of what has been said, to pull it all together. Your Royal Highness, many of the issues you've addressed have been touched upon in the various presentations, but I'd very much like you to maybe start with the issue of dignity, and what do you see, what can be done based on what you've heard to uphold people's dignity throughout the process of return. And I also would like the other panelists, we have 56 now on the system. If you have a question, please raise your hand in the system here and we'll come to you. And we're already starting to get a few questions from the social media, which I'll come back to in a minute. But first, Your Royal Highness, the floor is yours. You need to unmute.
First, Giles, I'd like to say to you directly, the first attempts to model and empirically examine the decision-making problem facing refugees from their own perspective, not from the perspective of policymakers in Europe and the United States, has been made by our Canadian friends at the International Immigration Policy Lab, and that is in combination with ETH Zurich. I would be happy to send you this brilliant study in the hope that what you have suggested, that is to say a US-UN study alongside it, which would look at Eurasia and Eurafrica. By the way, the most competent in the region in this regard is probably ASEAN. As I was told by Pascal Lamy, I regret his not being able to attend with us, but Lamy suggested the creation of a Middle Eastern Development Bank. So I would say to my friend Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Muraikhi that it is not only Islamic instruments of finance, it is also an international desire. And I had hoped that after the G22 meeting, that maybe some consideration could be made to go to the heart of the matter of human dignity. And in that regard, I would like to say to the two participants from Arab Barometer, who I know are with us, that it is about time that Arab Barometer developed attitude, not only passively recording, but also stating clearly the issues that we have discussed. First, we extend the study of economics of migration to refugee populations. That is, we ask those people directly. We humanize the stats. Second, refugee return is critical for understanding post-conflict reconstruction in both home countries as well as in neighboring states, as you rightly put it. If you are a German speaker and you arrive at the German border, you may not even end up in Germany. You might go to Switzerland if you are properly algorithmically weighted. And this is what I have at my disposal, thanks to these brilliant scholars. Third, research on immigrant native dynamics is what I found in the Stockholm University Center for Anthropology, Cultural Anthropology. That is what's important, cultural anthropology, because there's nothing cultural about globalization. There's nothing cultural about economics, but cultural anthropology, ethnicity, and migration. I hope that I could convince them to develop cultural anthropology to understand immigrant native dynamics, which often focus on host populations in the receiving country, examining the effect of immigration and refugees on local labor markets. I mean, we have a a big question across the way in Israel, which has achieved so much in such a short time. But at the same time, I would like to ask, what is their cultural anthropology in terms of Ashkenazi and Sephardi? What is their cultural anthropology in terms of the Palestinians, the Arabs, and what is their cultural policy in terms of Arab identity in general? Is it purely state-to-state actions, riding over or transcending the Mashriq region, which is the Levant region? Or do the Gulf countries also continue with their policy of understanding that we are not only a hinterland to the Gulf, but now we are becoming a hinterland to Europe as well? When we signed an agreement with the European Union, we, Jordan, were called geopolitically a Mediterranean littoral country. We don't have our feet on the sea shore in the Mediterranean. So does that mean that we are like Portugal, which also does not have a geopolitical proximity to the sea shore? Or are we basically looking at zones of influence? And when will people themselves in and of the region have something to do with shaping zones of influence and outcomes?
Thank you very much, Sidi Hassan. I'd like now to move to Ambassador Morehi. Ambassador Morehi, you emphasized the importance of the private sector and also raised the issue of Islamic social funding. And we have received a question here, which the question is basically saying, how would you sell this, the private sector, in a context where there is so much corruption at the moment? And the reference is made to Giles' comment about the missing billions that is going around with the private sector and so on. How would you sell that, and how will you align that with the requirements of Sharia law in terms of the use of zakat money?
Thank you. This is very important and a very good question that I will elaborate about what I'm doing in both initiative. In the private sector initiative, what I did, actually, I visited the CEO of the companies like Henry Schein, like MasterCard, like Ericsson, like UPS, like Qatar Financial Center, and other. And I limited the companies to be not too many companies, so that will make it easy for us to control the things and build the mechanism to help the UN agencies and the private sector to be a partner, I mean, in the strategic level rather than operational level. So we've met the first meeting in 2019 in Davos. I mean, in the forum, economic forum, and with World Economic Forum, and then we set together the principle of the UN agencies, WFP, UNICEF, OCHA, UNHCR, and IOM, and we discuss how can we solve the problem that facing the people in the ground, and how can we use the know-how of the private sector in different sectors, like in financial, in the technology, in communication, in logistics, and each of them, how can they contribute and find the best way and try to solve the problem collectively rather than each of them just working individual with one of the UN. This is the mechanism that we have, and the good thing that we make the private sector themselves lead the initiative rather than only the UN agencies. So it is a real partnership in the very strategic level rather than operational level. In the other hand, about the social Islamic finance and how can we do it, and I mentioned we have to start open the dialogue the problem that we are always facing. We try to put the mechanism and we invite everyone to accept this mechanism. But what I'm doing now, I'm trying to open the dialogue between the UN agencies to understand how is the mechanism in the UN, how they are working, how they are doing the job, how they implement their and how the system inside. And also at the same time, I'm inviting the scholar and the specialist in zakat and the Islamic finance, and try to open the dialogue between both parties and try to find where is the the meeting point between each of us. Can we implement the zakat through the UN, or it is not possible? Can the UN mechanism accept the categories of the zakat or not? And what is the best way to implement? And we try in this dialogue, we try to bring everyone, and it will be open. It will start, the kick-off event meeting will be on the January 2021, and it is open for everybody. It will open by Deputy of the Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, and it will be open for everyone. And then this is the first meeting, and then we will have different seminars about to understanding the zakat and the other Islamic finance. Then we have seminars in how the UN system work and how they did with the zakat, because some of the UN agencies already have implemented the zakat through their system. And then we will come up with a conclusion. What is the best way to implement it? And then, of course, we will have a report, and then we might have another round how we implement this mechanism.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope from this group, maybe there will be individuals who can join your discussions. Yeah. Sure. And I'm sure would benefit and enrich also the discussions. I have a question which applies probably to or links to what Alexandra said, and also to Dr. Dardari, which is around the issue of protection of returning refugees. The question is, what guarantees are there for the protection of returning refugees, in particular when their hometowns have been settled by internally displaced people from the same country? And this is a scenario that we're increasingly facing in places where there's been protracted conflict for more than 10 years. Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. Indeed, I think that to answer that question, I'd like to kind of take a step back a little bit, because it relates to what I was saying earlier, is how to ensure the sustainability of return. And part of that is, of course, ensuring the immediate protection and the security of those who are returning, and making sure that the conditions that they're returning to are conducive to a full and sustainable reintegration. Now, that is often not the case in the immediate term, which is, some of the examples that I refer to, from Iraq to Afghanistan, Nigeria, etc., where we're seeing actually refugees returning back, either not returning back directly to their area of origin, but returning back to conditions that are far from safe. But for me, it points to a larger question, and I'd like to refer back to what Mr. Al-Dardari was saying earlier, which is the paradigm shift that is needed to make sure that the response and the accompaniment of those return movements shifts away from a purely humanitarian one to a longer-term development one. And for that to happen, I think there needs to be far more monitoring and tracking of those movements over time. The problem that we face, at least that we've seen at IDMC, is that returning refugees are not actually tracked for a very long period of time beyond the point of drop-off or return in their country of origin. There's very little information and data available about the conditions the actual condition and the extent to which the return movement is already carried out in dignified conditions and in safe conditions. But there's even less information over the longer term, beyond maybe 3, 4, 6 months down the line. And in order for us to be able to ascertain the extent to which people are effectively reintegrating and integrating alongside host communities that, as you say, have been in place or have shifted during displacement as well. So in order for the international community and the national government to ascertain the degree, literally the degree of social cohesion and how that social cohesion evolves over time, you need a lot of data, and you need a lot of information to be collected on all sorts of indicators. And unfortunately, and this is where I think we do see a difference between refugees and IDPs, there's very little investment, or not little, but I would say there's insufficient investment in data collection and monitoring, particularly of IDP return movements and reintegration movements. So you were asking me, Professor Sultan, about Sudan earlier. I don't know the Sudanese context well enough to be able to weigh in on it, but what we have seen inside IDMC is that there's no real consolidated evidence base out there about what makes a successful returns process or IDP returns process and a successful reintegration process. And I think there would be a lot of lessons to be learned from a lot of countries around the world, but we just haven't sort of invested in synthesizing all of that and compiling that information to then be able to make it available to countries. And I think that there needs to be that data collection, and that analysis has to focus not just on the socioeconomic costs of displacement, because there is a cost and there's an obvious one, but there are also benefits, as many of the speakers have also said. And understanding, doing that cost-benefit analysis, I think, is what would then incentivize more focus on return and reintegration, and incentivize governments to provide that assistance over the longer term. I'd just like to end on just reflecting on what Giles was saying. I'm not sure, maybe I'm misunderstanding a little bit, but I do like the idea of focusing much more on trends analyses and projections. And there, His Royal Highness was mentioning the experience of ASEAN countries. I think there's a lot that can be learnt from how particularly Asian countries have been adept at projecting or anticipating the future impacts of climate change and disasters. And I think more and more countries, including in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, are going to be exposed to these threats in the future that are going to interact with political factors, and understanding how, putting in place already now the mechanisms that will allow them to respond over the longer term, I think is going to have to be a number one priority, just as much as the development approach to responding to existing crises. And there, I think we need to think about how to tie the response to internal displacement and to refugee crises to countries' existing national priorities, which unfortunately is not yet the case in all countries. It's still very much siloed out as a humanitarian issue and not embedded in a country's national development and risk reduction agenda. So again, I'm focusing a little bit on data and information, but I do feel that there's a huge gap there that could be filled with a number of sort of global platforms and global efforts.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. We've got 10 minutes left to reach the 90-minute target. And I'd like to invite my colleague from the center, Dr. Musa Alaya from Yemen. If you can please, Musa, ask your question and keep it very concise.
Thank you, Prof. Sultan, for giving me this chance to speak. And thank you for all speakers for their really very nice discussion and also ideas about the international development. And I think what they present, I think it was also a problem and a deep one for the international development for a long time, and especially when they started from giving aid based on the helping the public sector as a first way from 1950, and after that in the 1980 they started to also add the private sector based on the new public management orientation, and after that the governance orientation, and they start also held the non-governmental organization and the private sector and also including to the governmental sectors. And there are a lot of policies, and I evaluate the European policies towards Yemen and also to other countries. And I found out that it's not about the policy itself, but to find also a sound policy that can fit with the local environment. So we have one size fits for all, and I think they're repeating the same problem every time, from time to time, without also to consider the local context in every country. And I think also they have the same approach in United Nations and also in the World Bank. This is one problem, how to find also programs and policies that can fit with the local level. This is really one problem and big problem for the foreign aid system for, I think, like 70 years. The other thing is also about, I don't know why always the donors countries prefer to deliver the aid via the United Nations and the World Bank. And we know there is corruption within these organizations, and if you see the $1 is like $28 is used to 28 cents. It's used to create a new donations or to attract other money, and 8 cents it's used for the to run the UN organization. So that means it's around 36 cents of the dollar is used to the United Nations. And the rest of the money is going to the local or to the programs in the needed people. There is also corruption, the operational cost, also this really harassment from the conflicted factions. So if the needed people, I have calculations in many programs, especially in Yemen, is just only like 10 cents of the dollar.
Yes, thank you.
To the poor nations. So what is happening in this case? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. The point is clear. It's about contextualization of policy and the issue of corruption that we've already raised earlier. I have another question. We'll come back to whoever would like to answer this question to Musa. But I have another request from Youssef Hamiduddin.
Yes, thank you for the forum, and thank you all, and thank you Sidi Hassan for the informative session that we've had so far. Quick notes. It would be interesting to see, in the context of what we're trying to achieve, how capable are we to shift from organizations leading funding to more peer-to-peer models. I'd like to highlight the interesting continuous growth, exponential growth of Kickstarter. Kickstarter has witnessed more than $5.4 billion from peer-to-peer funding, backed by more than 18.9 million people, and having backed successfully around 193,000 different projects. So I think that peer-to-peer funding should be a key alternative that can probably liberate and bring people closer. Another point on Zakah, we've seen a very interesting case study out of Indonesia, again driven by peer-to-peer funding, which is a startup based out of Indonesia but backed by US venture capital, that has witnessed in the last 3 years a growth from a couple of dollars when the startup was incorporated to now having raised around $45 million from peer-to-peer funding, predominantly focused on an Indonesian context. And last but not least is the work that I also I'm trying to advocate for is building a Yemen fund dedicated to inviting startups to focus on accelerating the resolution of these different issues that can hopefully contribute to more innovative ways and inclusive ways of funding. So it would be interesting to see how can we really deliver that paradigm shift and see more peer-to-peer and more interventions driven by innovation in the context of what we're trying to achieve. And thank you for that.
Thank you very much. May I come back to Abdullah Dardari? Are you still there? I cannot see Abdullah.
I am here.
Yes, you're here.
Yes,
if you could please help us address the issue of the contextualization of policy, that what Dr. Musa has raised earlier, that a lot of this policy is made one size fits all, and it gets rolled out. Is that accurate, and to what extent you're trying to contextualize it within, say, Afghanistan?
It's partially accurate. It's just simply because these organizations, all of us in the UN system, you cannot have, I mean, for example, UNDP is in 122 countries. So it must have a general system that runs UNDP, but at the same time, we have dramatic flexibility to contextualize in each country. For example, and I would like, if you don't mind, to address Mr. Youssef's very important comment. We are now working on a very important platform for sustainable development goals finance in Afghanistan, moving away, as I said, from funding in the traditional way into innovative financing of development projects, using blended finance, using crowdfunding, using Islamic sukuk for environmental projects like renewable energy and irrigation systems. And just to give you an idea that it's not a question of shortage of funds. Afghans have deposits in US dollars in Afghanistan banks of $9 billion. That's 40% of Afghanistan's GDP. That money, if invested in Afghanistan, and this is what we're trying to do. What is the necessary steps that we need to take to release these funds into the Afghan economy? An investment of 40% of GDP can boost employment and can boost growth dramatically if well invested. So now we are contextualizing the question of finance, development finance, to the Afghan context, Afghan diaspora, Afghanistan savings, and we will see that it is not a question of shortage of funding, rather than a question of governance. We simulated that the largest impact on growth in Afghanistan is improved governance and fighting corruption. It's not, investments comes number two. So the potential of absorbing well these returnees and turning them into a power for the economy and for the society is tremendous. I'd like 1 second to say on what Sidi Hassan mentioned on ethnopolicy. The strongest pull factor in Afghanistan is the Afghan identity. Afghan identity survived, proved to be extremely resilient, despite the ethnic divide and what appears to be a fragmented country. People want to come back to Afghanistan, even though their standard of living in Afghanistan is lower, according to all surveys, is lower than their standard of living in their host countries. Back to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Riva Nasrawain.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity too. I just had a couple of ideas or questions, but I will be very short. At the end of the day, I am not a politician nor an economic person, but what can we do to ensure as NGOs or to ensure this effectiveness and sustainable return of refugees, and as well to make sure of their quality of return and quality of life, and the steps that can be taken to safeguard these refugees in the process of their return, the quality, the dignity that they should have. Our mission here is also to make sure that these human to leave no one behind, and at the same time to stress on their humanitarian side, not just the economic side and the all other aspects, but to make sure that these are human beings that they want to return back to their countries, and to make sure they return safely and live with the quality of life that they want to have. And we have to start here and now, with maybe some some ideas that we can implement directly right now. This is like in a short. Thank you very much, and I'm very much I do appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riva. I must admit we probably misplanned this event. We should have planned for 2-3 hours. An hour and a half is far too short for the many important and complex issues raised. But with your permission, I'd like to give the last opportunity to His Royal Highness, and to combine Riva's question, Your Royal Highness, with another question that we have received here from the social media. which says what mechanisms can be implemented to increase regional and local participation in the reintegration of refugees? How can regional institutions and governments become leading partners in the strategic and the logistical as well as the operational level of reintegration for refugees, with a particular reference maybe to the region in the Arab world?
May I respond by suggesting that we are, all of us, not important. Even the last lady who asked the question is not important. What is important is to front end our concerns for the people who are important, and they are the vulnerable and the marginalized. They are not an endangered species. We've had refugees in Jordan since 1948. Have you bothered to go down to those refugee camps and find out under what conditions they have evolved, have been reaccommodated in terms of Jordan's integrated process? I would like to ask directly all of you whether it is humanly possible to talk about this front ending in terms of we're asking the questions. We ask, when do refugees return? We ask, how do we develop research, design data, develop observational data on return interventions, intentions, and so forth. But I would like to ask you, isn't it time that we gave support to those such as, and I go back to the Canadian initiative with which I am familiar, and particularly the Canadian feminine initiatives, to ask, have we actually gone to a refugee camp, a Syrian refugee camp in this instance, to ask the following question: do you, the respondent, plan to return to Syria in the next 12 months? Have we built the confidence to be able to ask such a question? You asked us, Sultan Barakat and your brilliant center, to develop a rapport with refugees. And I would like to thank Abdullah Dardari for coming from the country or working in the country where a citizens' charter is a continuation of its flagship development, the National Solidarity Program, as you have described it. Can we develop a convincing citizens' charter when we understand that sustainable development goals, and here I go back to what you were saying, Giles Merritt, earlier, were launched in 2015. This is in your preamble. Despite its commitment to leave no one behind, what you just said, if you'd read your homework, you wouldn't have asked the question. There was no single indicator on refugees out of 200 indicators across 17 goals. The word refugee just does not appear in the so-called sustainable development goals. Whilst there has recently been agreement to a new indicator added under SDG 16, I mean, I was responsible for advising the UN Secretary General on water and sanitation. And when I said sanitation, some people simpered. And I said, well, when your child is deprived of a toilet he can get to, or your wife is deprived of a toilet she can get to without being raped on the way, then you will be laughing on the other side of your face. This is a real crisis that we are facing today and every day. I remember triple antigen vaccine, we're talking about vaccines. We couldn't get enough doctors to provide triple antigen because bureaucracy had taken a national holiday. I got volunteers and I got the armed forces who are always our backup to offer those vaccines, triple antigen, mumps, measles, and rubella. I'm just wondering why it is that refugees and migrants among those most vulnerable in disasters and hazards, and I would tell you, as you have told us, Sultan, that the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, displaced communities are peripheral rather than a major concern. So if the Sendai framework for disaster risk regard refugees as peripheral, I would ask also, why it is that if we have a United Nations disaster risk reduction, why don't we have a disaster risk prevention in terms of some samplings of what could be done? You asked us, and I'm concluding with your questions, what works in ensuring the effectiveness and sustainability of return as a durable solution? I would say regional politics. We cannot transcend a single border and manage our water, our energy, our food, our nutrition, let alone our education nexus, if we don't look regionally at the issue. And that includes the whole of the Levant region. It includes potentially Israel, but as I keep saying, Israel does whatever it wants, and it is wherever it wants, any time of the day or night, because it has superlative backing. So it's not a question of my going and lobbying in Washington for the next few months and saying refugees, refugees. There has to be a change of mindset to focus, as Professor Lindner has told us, on the movement, the progression from humiliation to dignity. We are told by a prominent political scientist in Europe, Dominic Moisey, that the Europeans are afraid and we suffer from humiliation. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of our refugees. And yet here Giles Merritt, a respected member of the European Union and community, tells us we need young blood. That's what I understood. We need young talent. We need new migrants. Well, tell that to the people who regard us as Arabs and Muslims as wild beasts. Tell it to the extreme right in many countries, including the country just down the road, who have no cultural affinity for us. The question of a civilized framework for disagreement means that you can disagree with me. I will respect your right to disagree with me, and you will respect my right to express my view. But I think this is also a cultural issue. How do we develop a region after we have destroyed Mesopotamia after the intervention in Iraq? I remember sitting in an office of the director of the British Museum just a few hours before the bombing started on Baghdad. Baghdad of history, not Baghdad of Saddam Hussein. And the question came from the Pentagon, what is archaeologically significant about Mesopotamia? In what ways can we link return to progress in reconstruction in states of origin? I would say that the Mediterranean, and here is the role of Europe, the trillions that you mentioned, should reach out to our northern littoral and regard it as a nexus. I only heard one American Secretary of State in my lifetime saying the Mediterranean is a nexus. Cyrus Vance said the Mediterranean is a nexus. Otherwise, 1 minute we are the soft underbelly of NATO, the other minute we're good neighborhood policy, the third, there's an alphabet soup. There are silos in the United Nations system that don't talk to each other, that are competing with each other at the expense of the public good. So I would say that in terms of ways of returning, we have to somehow downplay nationalist fervor and look at the people, look at the human beings, recognize the trees from the woods. Are host countries, you asked Dr. Sultan, able to continue coping given the current COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent economic turndown? What steps can be taken to safeguard refugees and prevent ill-judged returns? Well, I would look at this region once again and say we need an ECOSOC, an Economic and Social Council, based in the region. So we address the region from this region. We address the world from this region. We don't listen to what New York has to say, or what Geneva has to say, or what Paris has to say, or London, or anyone else, or Riyadh in the G22. We say, before we hold the summit meeting, what do the private sector, the undersecretaries, the civil society have to say in recommendation for policy alternatives. If you have policy alternatives, you have a right to live and live comfortably. If you have no policy alternatives, then you are inviting the very anarchy that you claim to fear. How can the international community balance between its humanitarian and developmental responsibilities towards returning refugees and the desire to see political regimes behave in accordance with international law and standards? I had the privilege of working with leading luminaries in the 1980s. Simone Weil was one of them, Robert McNamara was another. There's only one survivor actually at the moment. Of course, Desmond Tutu was our colleague, but one survivor, and that is David Owen and myself. I'm probably the last of the Mohicans. So I want to say that when we presented the call for an independent humanitarian order, we looked at three categories of issues. Man against man, whether in a domestic situation or regional situation or international situation. I am already beyond the pale because I'm considered to be a maverick, which means I have a mind of my own, thank goodness. So we had another category, which was man against nature, ecological disasters. And we had a third category. We were in Stockholm in the week of the Chernobyl disaster, which was man-made disasters. I wasn't in Japan when they had this most recent tsunami and nuclear disaster, but let's not forget that these things are happening around us. And when they talk about Iran and disaster prevention, the fact is that any outbreak, any conflagration in this region, and I say it particularly with great respect to my Gulf friends, any conflagration, any bomb that lands short of its target in the neighboring country, in the country we neighbor, the prevailing westerly wind will kill all of us, including certainly myself, because we do not even have shelters. We don't have nuclear-proof shelters. We don't have chemical-proof shelters. So it's all very well to say, you know, let us remove this one and that one from the map and so forth. All I want to say is, in terms of humanitarian and developmental responsibilities, this is a function of the Geneva Convention, which we have to address, in the words of Giles Merritt, in any reforming of the objectives of the Geneva Convention. We're celebrating at the same time, how many years is it of the United Nations?
75.
75? And how many years of Nagasaki and Hiroshima? 75. So you have the shit in one hand and you have holy water in the other. For God's sake, I mean, wake up, let's stop pussyfooting around the whole thing and be very clear that in the question of leave no one behind, which my colleague here referred to, it is central to global policy framework, not only in terms of refugee return and reintegration, but to focus, as you said, in your aims and objectives for this meeting, and I hope it's the beginning of a process, not a one-off, regional and global attention on the issue of forced displacement, the challenges and dilemmas associated with refugee return and reintegration, and I would say inclusionist thinking. So I would like to thank you very much for considering effective strategies and more prominent positioning of the refugee return and reintegration issue and mobilizing new sources of support. By the way, I would say to Sayyid Ahmed Al-Marihi, I appreciate everything he said, but please remember one English politician, not a very prominent one, but a man called David Cameron. David Cameron wanted to turn London. He went to a school called Eton, which I, having studied at Harrow, of course, looked down on, because there's always this competition between public schools and English education. But anyway, he went to Eton for better or for worse. And he came up with this wonderful idea: why can't London become a hub of Islamic finance? Well, why can't Mecca become a hub of Islamic finance? Why is it that when they build a shiny building in Paris or London and call it Islamic banking, although I find a contradiction in the two, or call it Islamic bonds or Islamic leasing, why do they put like jam on bread and butter the word Islamic? Of course, when it's Islamic something else and people are getting killed in the street, I have to go to Copenhagen and to mediate for Monday morning, the newspaper, between the Imam and the body politic of Denmark. And at that time, Denmark was at the head of the Baltic community of states. And I said, you all have blood on your hands. From Dakar, Senegal to Dhaka, Bangladesh. You have moved millions of thousands of people's feelings, rightly, wrongly, to what degree, whether they should be civilized citizens of the earth, or whatever you like to say. Who has the responsibility for this blood on the hands? And I want to say once again that when you come to Islamic zakat, it's only 2.5% of your wealth, not of your income. What's 2.5% of the wealth of the Muslim world? And what is it in contrast to the benefits, that it benefits not only Muslims? When a child comes to your hospital with cancer, you don't say, is he this or is he that? Or is she this or is she that? You say, this is a human being and we have to save his or her life. And I want to maybe say to my Yemeni friend, first you asked about corruption in the Arab world. The absence of straight thinking is also a form of corruption. Good governance is the antidote to corruption. I had been hoping that coming from the Yemen that you would have asked about the IDP response in Yemen. And I want to salute Filippo Grandi, who has sent me all kinds of information. It's so encyclopedic that I can't cover it, but the Horn of Africa, Yemen, the Red Sea. And he says, and I quote, UNHCR started the distribution of cash assistance to help internally displaced families prepare for the winter. Is it the responsibility of UNHCR alone to do that? Over the reporting period, partners worked with displaced communities to set up some 900 new transitional shelters in Aden, Lahaj, Taiz, Hudaydah. About 3,380. This is tokenism, but they're doing it. Like the Red Cross would be working in certain areas too. It may be tokenism, but they are actually doing it. كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون.
Yes.
They're doing it for the Mahara in Hadramaut, in Ma'rib, in Hudaydah, in Sa'da, in Jof, in Ib, and in Taiz. And what are the politicians of this region doing, talking about bringing pipelines from the Arabian Sea to the Mediterranean Sea? I have no objection to infrastructure, but what is it going to do to the marginalized and the vulnerable people? Is it going to make them more bitter because of being excluded? Or is it going to be inclusive and contribute to their human dignity? I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Your Royal Highness. I'm afraid we need to conclude the session on these wonderful thoughts from His Royal Highness. And we feel, at least at this center, the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, we're trying to address one of the main concerns of Sidi Hassan, and that is to be focused on our region and our culture. And I'm very grateful to the opportunity to work with the World Refugee and Migration Council on this. And as His Royal Highness said, we don't really see this as an end. This is very much the start of a process. We have held our first conference last year. We identified the issue of return as a priority to be engaged. And we hope to continue in partnership with all of you who've taken part in this seminar to try and find some solutions and address the issues in a way that preserve people's dignity while address their immediate security and the need for our region to act regionally based on its own resources even. Thank you very much to all for taking part in this. Thank you to our technical team and the teams both at the World Refugee Migration Council and the Center who helped put this together. And a special thank you to my friends at His Royal Highness's office and to all of you again. Thank you very much for being part of this. شكرا جزيلا سيدي حسن.